Sometimes life kicks you when you're already down, and Miguel Salazar knew that feeling all too well. The widowed father stood in his late grandfather's junkyard, watching his teenage son's dreams slip away while creditors circled and neighbors whispered about his family's shame. Everyone said the junkyard was worthless, just acres of scrap metal under the hot sun. But when Miguel moved some old car frames, he found a locked building hiding 3 old warplanes from World War II. These planes were worth $15 million and thought to be lost forever. Now Miguel had 90 days to prove they belonged to him before losing everything. Would a father's desperate love and a grandfather's buried secrets be enough to save his family's future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a postal worker who looked apologetic even before Miguel opened the door. Miguel Salazar wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag, leaving dark smears across the terry cloth as he accepted the certified envelope. The return address made his stomach clench. Hartwell, Associates, Attorneys at Law. Inside his cluttered auto repair shop, the smell of motor oil and brake fluid mixed with the lingering aroma of the morning's coffee. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope, though whether from the 3 cups of caffeine he'd already consumed or from dread, he couldn't say. The letterhead was crisp, official, and cold. "Dear Mr. Salazar," it began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your grandfather, Esteban Salazar, on March 15th. As per his last will and testament, you have inherited his property located at 847 Desert Ridge Road, consisting of approximately 47 acres and associated structures." Miguel sank into the cracked vinyl chair behind his desk. 47 acres of what? He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in over 15 years, not since the old man had refused to attend Carmen's funeral. The memory still stung his wife's casket being lowered into the ground while his grandfather remained stubbornly absent, nursing some ancient grievance that Miguel had never fully understood. The shop's bell chimed, and 17-year-old Mateo pushed through the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his dark hair falling across his eyes in that way that made him look exactly like Carmen had at that age. Miguel quickly folded the letter and shoved it into his desk drawer. "How was school?" Miguel asked, forcing his voice to sound normal. Mateo shrugged, a gesture that had become his primary form of communication over the past year. "Fine. Mrs. Henderson says I need to start thinking about college applications, but I told her we probably can't afford it anyway." The words hit Miguel like a wrench to the chest. He watched his son disappear into the back room, where he kept his woodworking project-centricate model airplanes carved from balsa wood with a precision that amazed Miguel. The boy had inherited his mother's artistic hands and his grandfather's stubborn attention to detail, though Miguel had never told him about that last part. That evening, after Mateo had gone to his room to work on homework and listen to music through headphones that were probably too loud, Miguel retrieved the letter and read it again. The attorney wanted him to call within 30 days to arrange for the property transfer. There was also mention of outstanding debts and liens that would need to be addressed. Miguel opened his laptop, the ancient machine wheezing to life like his grandfather's old pickup truck used to do on cold mornings. He searched for the address on satellite maps, zooming in on what appeared to be a sprawling collection of structures scattered across desert land about 2 hours south of Phoenix. Even from the aerial view, he could see the place was a junkyard row upon row of rusted vehicles, piles of scrap metal, and buildings that looked like they'd been assembled from whatever materials happened to be lying around. His phone buzzed with a text message from First National Bank. "Payment overdue. Contact us immediately to avoid further collection. Action." Miguel closed the laptop and rubbed his temples. The shop wasn't generating enough income to keep up with the mortgage on their small house, let alone Mateo's college dreams. Every month brought new notices, new threats, new reminders that he was failing as a provider. Carmen would have known what to do. She'd always been better with money, better with planning, better with hope. The next morning, Miguel found Mateo in the kitchen, eating cereal while scrolling through his phone. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air and highlighting the crack in the glass that Miguel kept meaning to fix. "I need to take a trip," Miguel said, pouring coffee into a mug that read, "World's Greatest Dad, a Father's Day gift from what felt like a lifetime ago. Want to come with me?" Mateo looked up, suspicious. "Where?" "To see some property your great-grandfather left us." "I didn't know I had a great-grandfather." Miguel sat down across from his son, noting how Mateo's shoulders had broadened over the past year, how his voice had deepened, how he was becoming a young man despite Miguel's feeling that he'd just learned to walk yesterday. "He was my grandfather, Esteban Salazar. We weren't close." "What kind of property?" Miguel hesitated. "A junkyard." Mateo's spoon clinked against his bowl. "Seriously, that's what he left us? A junkyard? It might be worth something. Land values, you know." Mateo snorted, a sound that reminded Miguel uncomfortably of his own teenage skepticism. "Right, so instead of inheriting money for college, I get a pile of junk in the desert. We don't know what's there until we look." They drove south on Interstate 17, the Phoenix skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror as desert landscape opened up around them. Saguaro cacti stood like sentries in the distance, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the relentless sun. Miguel had rolled down the windows instead of running the air conditioning, partly to save gas, and partly because he'd always found the desert air somehow cleansing, even when it was hot enough to melt asphalt. Mateo had his earbuds in and was staring out the passenger window, but Miguel caught him stealing glances at the scenery. The boy had inherited Carmen's love of wide-open spaces, though he'd never admit it. They turned off the highway onto a dirt road that wound through scrub brush and scattered boulders. A weathered sign announced Salazar Salvage in faded red letters, with smaller text below advertising auto parts, scrap metal, reasonable prices. Someone had spray-painted "Closed" across the bottom of the sign in black letters. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and padlock, but Miguel found the key in an envelope the attorney had given him. The chain rattled against the metal posts as he unwound it, the sound echoing across the empty desert, like a death knell for his hopes of finding anything valuable. The property stretched out before them acre after acre of automotive graveyard. Cars from every decade since the 1940s sat in rough rows, their paint faded to the color of rust and dust. Some were stacked 3 high, creating metal mountains that cast long shadows across the sandy ground. Pickup trucks, sedans, muscle cars, family haulers all slowly returning to the earth under the patient desert sun. "This is what he left us?" Mateo pulled out his earbuds, his voice filled with disgust. "Look at this place. It's like a car cemetery." Miguel walked between the rows, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered metal fragments. Despite the apparent chaos, there was an organization to it: domestic cars in one section, imports in another, trucks along the back perimeter. His grandfather had been methodical, even in his hoarding. They found the main building, a corrugated steel structure that might have been white once, but now wore the patina of decades under the desert sun. Inside, the air was stifling and filled with the smell of old motor oil, rubber, and something else. Something that reminded Miguel of his grandfather's cologne, a scent he hadn't thought about in years. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that looked older than Miguel himself. Hand-forged wrenches, precision measuring instruments, and strange devices he couldn't identify. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but beneath it, the tools were clean and well-maintained. His grandfather might have been a pack rat, but he'd taken care of his equipment. "Look at this stuff," Mateo said, picking up a wooden-handled awl with a brass ferrule. "This is like museum-quality craftsmanship." Miguel watched his son examine the tool with the same careful attention he gave to his model airplanes. There was something in Mateo's expressionar recognition, maybe, of quality and purpose. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, finding buildings filled with sorted parts, organized by type and year. Engines hung from chain hoists, their components tagged and catalogued. Transmission cases were stacked like cordwood. Shelves held thousands of smaller parts carburetors, alternators, starter saw labeled with tags written in his grandfather's careful script. He wasn't just collecting junk, Matteo observed as they walked between towering shelves of inventory. He was preserving things, like these cars might be totaled, but all their parts could fix other cars. Miguel felt a strange pride at his son's insight. Maybe there was something here worth preserving, even if it wasn't the instant windfall he'd hoped for. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Miguel found himself standing in the center of the yard, surrounded by the remnants of a lifetime of collecting. His grandfather had spent decades gathering these pieces of automotive history, and Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than simple salvage operation. "We should head back," Matteo said, but his voice lacked its earlier disdain. "It's getting dark." Miguel nodded, but as they walked toward the car, something caught his eye, a glint of metal behind a wall of stacked car bodies, almost hidden in shadow. For just a moment, it looked like something that didn't belong, something that wasn't automotive. "Did you see that?" he asked Matteo. "See what?" Miguel pointed toward the back corner of the property, but the angle of the light had changed, and whatever he'd glimpsed was lost in shadow again. "Nothing," he said. "Just thought I saw something." But as they drove home through the gathering darkness, Miguel couldn't shake the image from his mind. Something large and metallic, hidden behind decades of accumulated vehicles. Something that didn't fit with the rest of his grandfather's carefully organized chaos. Something that might change everything. Miguel couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the glint of metal he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, hidden behind the wall of rusted vehicles. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was probably just another car, maybe an old truck or trailer his grandfather had tucked away. But the image nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. "We're going back," he announced to Matteo over breakfast. His son looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "To the junkyard? Why?" "I want to take another look around. Maybe there's something we missed." Matteo shrugged and went back to his phone, but Miguel caught him packing a water bottle and his camera before they left. Maybe the boy was more curious than he let on. The drive back seemed shorter in daylight, the desert landscape less mysterious and more welcoming under the morning sun. They arrived at the junkyard just as the temperature was beginning its daily climb toward unbearable, the metal gate already warm to the touch. This time, Miguel headed straight for the back corner where he'd seen the mysterious glint. The stacked cars formed a canyon of rust and faded paint, their windows long since shattered by desert storms and the patient work of time. Some had been stripped of useful parts, leaving skeletal frames that cast intricate shadows on the sandy ground. "What exactly are we looking for?" Matteo asked, following his father through the narrow passages between the automotive monuments. "I'm not sure. Something that seemed out of place yesterday." They worked their way deeper into the maze, past cars from the 50s with their elaborate chrome bumpers and tail fins, through a section of 70s, muscle cars with their hoods propped open like hungry mouths. Miguel's grandfather had arranged them roughly by decade, creating an unintentional museum of American automotive design. "Dad, look at this." Miguel turned to find Matteo standing beside a 1967 Mustang Fastback, its blue paint faded but still recognizable. The car was in better condition than most of the others, and someone had carefully covered the interior with a tarp. "He took care of this one," Matteo observed, running his hand along the hood, like he was planning to restore it. Miguel felt another pang of regret about his estrangement from the old man. How many projects had his grandfather worked on alone out here? How many dreams had he pursued in solitude, while Miguel nursed his grievances in Phoenix? They continued deeper into the automotive graveyard, and that's when Miguel saw it again, a flash of something metallic and angular behind a particularly tall stack of car bodies. This time, he was certain it wasn't another vehicle. "There," he pointed, "behind those cars." Mateo squinted in the direction Miguel indicated. "I don't see anything. We need to move some of these cars to get a better look." It took them 2 hours of careful maneuvering, using the yard's ancient forklift that Miguel was amazed still ran, to create a gap in the wall of vehicles. The forklift wheezed and groaned like an arthritic old man, but it did the job, lifting rusted hulks and setting them down in new positions. What they revealed took Miguel's breath away. Hidden behind the automotive barrier was a corrugated steel building he hadn't noticed on their first visit. It was larger than the main workshop, probably 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with no windows and a pair of heavy steel doors secured with 3 separate padlocks. The building looked newer than the rest of the structures, its walls straight and solid despite decades under the desert sun. "What do you think is in there?" Mateo whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever secrets the building held. Miguel approached the doors slowly, noting the quality of the locks. They were substantial, the kind used to protect valuable equipment. His grandfather hadn't been protecting junk behind these doors. He pulled out the ring of keys the attorney had given him, a collection of brass and steel that had grown warm in his pocket. Most were clearly for vehicles or standard doors, but 3 keys stood out heavier, more complex, with the kind of precision machining that suggested expensive locks. The first key fit the top padlock perfectly. It turned with a solid click that echoed off the metal walls. The second lock opened just as easily, and the third practically fell off its hasp, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Miguel's hands were shaking as he grasped the door handle. Behind him, Mateo had grown completely silent, the weight of anticipation settling over both of them like desert heat. The doors swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, and Miguel stepped into darkness that smelled of oil, canvas, and something else, something familiar but impossible to place. He fumbled along the wall until he found a light switch, and banks of fluorescent fixtures flickered to life overhead. What they illuminated made Miguel question his sanity. 3 aircraft sat in the hangar like sleeping giants, their forms draped in canvas covers that had kept the desert dust at bay for decades. Even covered, their shapes were unmistakably military, the angular wings, the aggressive stance, the purposeful lines that spoke of power and precision. "Holy," Mateo started, then caught himself. "Dad, are those airplanes?" Miguel moved like a man in a dream, approaching the nearest aircraft with the reverence usually reserved for churches or graveyards. The canvas covering was secured with ties that had been carefully knotted, the work of someone who intended to preserve what lay beneath. His fingers fumbled with the knots, years of working with rope and wire helping him despite his trembling hands. The canvas fell away to reveal something that belonged in a museum, not hidden in a desert junkyard. The aircraft was a fighter plane from World War II, its aluminum skin polished to mirror brightness despite its age. The cockpit canopy was intact, the propeller blades positioned with mechanical precision. Along the fuselage, faded but still visible, were the numbers 44, 83,887, and below that, in smaller letters, Betty's Dream. "This is impossible," Miguel whispered. "These things don't just exist in private collections." Mateo had pulled the cover off the second aircraft, revealing another wartime fighter with twin engines and an unusual twin fuselage design that Miguel had never seen before. This one bore the markings 44,65,168 and the name Desert Fox, painted in flowing script below the cockpit. The third plane was different, sleeker, more modern-looking despite its obvious age. When they removed its cover, they found an aircraft painted in navy blue with white stars, its single engine cowling gleaming like jewelry under the fluorescent lights. Miguel walked around the planes in stunned silence, noting details that spoke of careful preservation. The tires were properly inflated, the control surfaces moved freely when touched, and everything was clean and well maintained. Someone had been caring for these aircraft long after the war had ended. "Dad," Mateo's voice was barely a whisper, "do you know what these are?" Miguel shook his head, but even as he did, memories began surfacing. stories his grandfather had told when Miguel was very young, before the arguments and estrangement had driven them apart. Stories about the war, about planes and pilots, about things that couldn't be spoken of outside the family. "I think," Miguel said slowly, "your great-grandfather had more secrets than we ever imagined." On a workbench along the far wall, he found a manila folder thick with papers. Inside were maintenance logs, fuel consumption records, and correspondence with military surplus dealers that dated back to 1946. The papers were yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, as if his grandfather had known that someday someone would need to understand what he'd done and why. At the bottom of the folder was a letter written in his grandfather's careful script, addressed simply to "My family." Miguel's hands shook as he unfolded it. "These birds came home from the war broken in spirit, if not in body," the letter began. "The government wanted to melt them down for scrap, but I couldn't let that happen. Every rivet, every wire, every piece of aluminum skin represents the courage of young men who gave everything for their country. I saved them not for profit, but for memory. If you're reading this, I hope you'll understand that some things are worth more than money. They're worth preserving for the generations who will never know the sound of freedom flying overhead." Miguel looked up at the three aircraft, seeing them now not as valuable antiques, but as monuments to sacrifice and courage. His grandfather hadn't been hoarding junkhead, been preserving history. "We need to find out exactly what we have here," he said to Mateo, who was photographing every detail with his phone. "And we need to figure out what to do with them." As they locked the hangar and prepared to leave, Miguel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't just airplanes, they were a legacy, a trust that had been passed down to him whether he deserved it or not. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was whispering that 3 preserved World War II fighters might just be worth enough money to change his and Mateo's lives forever. Miguel spent that evening hunched over his laptop, squinting at the screen while Mateo worked on homework at the kitchen table. The ancient machine struggled with multiple browser tabs as Miguel researched World War II aircraft, trying to match what they'd found with historical records and auction results. "The twin-engine one looks like a P-82 twin Mustang," he said, reading from a vintage aircraft website. "Says here they only made about 200 of them." Mateo looked up from his calculus homework. "Is that good or bad?" "For rarity, very good. For finding parts or maintenance information, probably very bad." Miguel clicked through dozens of aircraft identification pages, comparing photos to the images Mateo had taken on his phone. The single-engine fighter was clearly a P-51 Mustang, one of the most famous fighters of the war. The navy blue plane was harder to identify. Its lines were similar to other World War II fighters, but something about its configuration seemed unique. "Here," Miguel said, finding a page about experimental aircraft. "I think the blue one might be some kind of prototype. Look at this engine cowling design. It's different from anything else I've seen." By midnight, Miguel had filled a notebook with aircraft serial numbers, specifications, and production numbers. What he'd learned both excited and terrified him. If the planes were authentic, and everything suggested they were, they represented a collection worth potentially millions of dollars. The next morning, Miguel called in sick to the shop and drove to the Phoenix Public Library. The reference librarian, a woman with gray hair and infinite patience, helped him access aviation databases and historical archives that weren't available online. "You're researching some very rare aircraft," she observed, pulling up procurement records from the National Archives. "May I ask why?" Miguel hesitated, then decided honesty might serve him better than evasion. "I inherited some planes from my grandfather. I'm trying to figure out what they are and what they might be worth." The librarian's eyebrows rose. "Inherited airplanes? That's certainly unusual. What types are we talking about?" Miguel showed her Mateo's photos, and her expression grew increasingly serious as she examined each image. "Mr. Salazar," she said quietly, "if these are authentic, you've inherited some of the rarest aircraft in existence." This P-82 twin Mustang, there are maybe 5 flying examples left in the world. And this prototype, she pointed to the blue plane, I'm not sure I've ever seen anything exactly like it. She helped him identify the mystery aircraft, an experimental F-7F Tigercat variant that had been modified for carrier operations but never entered production. According to the records, only 3 had been built, and all were thought to have been scrapped after the war. You need to speak with someone who specializes in warbird authentication, the librarian advised. These aircraft, if genuine, represent significant historical artifacts. They belong in museums, in the hands of very serious collectors. Miguel left the library with a stack of photocopied articles and a growing sense that he was in over his head. The planes weren't just valuable, they were historically significant. And that meant people would be very interested in acquiring them. His phone was ringing when he got back to the car. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Salazar? This is Richard Hartwell, your grandfather's attorney. I hope you had a chance to visit the property. Yes, we went out there yesterday. Good, good. I wanted to let you know that I've had several inquiries about the land. There's a development company very interested in making an offer. Miguel's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of development company? Desert Vista Resorts. They're looking to build a luxury golf and spa resort in that area. The location is perfect for their needs, remote but accessible with those beautiful mountain views. What kind of offer are we talking about? They're prepared to move quickly, cash sale, above market value for undeveloped desert land. I have the preliminary paperwork here, if you'd like to review it. Miguel thought about the hangar hidden behind stacks of cars, about 3 irreplaceable aircraft that no one else knew existed. I need some time to think about it. Of course, but I should mention that they'd like to move forward soon. Development projects like this require extensive planning, and they want to break ground before summer. After hanging up, Miguel sat in his car outside the library, watching people come and go while his mind raced. The smart thing would be to sell the land to the developers. Quick, clean, profitable enough money to pay off his debts and maybe even start a college fund for Mateo. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 3 aircraft sitting in their hidden hangar, preserved by his grandfather's dedication and devotion. How could he destroy that legacy for a golf resort? That evening, he called the number the librarian had given him for Tom Bradley, a retired Air Force mechanic who'd become an expert in warbird authentication. Salazar, Bradley said when Miguel explained the situation. Your grandfather was Esteban Salazar. You knew him? Knew of him. He was legendary in the vintage aircraft community, always showing up at swap meets, looking for specific parts, always willing to pay top dollar for authentic pieces. We all wondered what he was working on, but he never said. Miguel felt a strange pride hearing his grandfather described with respect and admiration. Would you be willing to look at what he left behind? Son, if Esteban Salazar preserved 3 warbirds for 60 years, you can bet there's something special. When can we meet? They arranged to meet at the Junkyard the following Saturday. Miguel spent the rest of the week trying to act normal, going through the motions at his shop while his thoughts remained focused on the hidden hangar and its contents. On Friday afternoon, a black SUV pulled up outside his shop. 2 men in expensive suits got out, and Miguel's instincts immediately put him on alert. They didn't look like customers. Mr. Salazar, the older man extended his hand. I'm James Morrison, from Desert Vista Resorts. I believe our attorney spoke with you about your grandfather's property. Miguel wiped his hands on a shop rag before shaking. I'm still considering my options. Of course. These things take time. I was hoping I might be able to visit the property myself, just to get a better sense of the development potential. I don't think that's necessary right now. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Mr. Salazar, I understand you might have sentimental attachment to the property. But let's be practical, it's a junkyard in the middle of nowhere. What possible use could you have for 47 acres of scrap metal? Miguel met his gaze steadily. Like I said, I'm still considering my options. After the men left, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison's visit had been more about intimidation than negotiation. The man had seemed too eager, too insistent for someone making a routine business inquiry. That night, Miguel made a decision that surprised even him. He wasn't going to sell the land, at least not until he understood exactly what his grandfather had left him and why. The planes were part of something larger, a story that began in a war fought before Miguel was born and ended in a desert hangar where 3 aircraft waited patiently for someone to understand their significance. He had a feeling that understanding was going to cost him more than he'd bargained for, but some things, as his grandfather's letter had said, were worth more than money. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of desert clarity that made everything seem possible. Miguel and Mateo drove out to the junkyard to meet Tom Bradley, both of them quiet with anticipation. Miguel had spent the night wondering if he was making a terrible mistake by trusting a stranger with his grandfather's secret, but the librarian had vouched for Bradley's reputation and integrity. They found Bradley waiting by the gate, a lean man in his 70s, with silver hair and hands that bore the permanent stains of decades working with aircraft. He wore a faded Air Force cap and an expression of barely contained excitement. "You boys ready to make some history?" he asked as Miguel unlocked the chain. Bradley's reaction to the junkyard surprised Miguel. Instead of dismissing the endless rows of rusted vehicles, the old mechanic moved through them with obvious appreciation, occasionally stopping to examine a particular car or engine. "Your grandfather had an eye for quality," Bradley observed, running his hand along the hood of a 1970 Plymouth Cuda. "Even his automotive collection shows real knowledge. This stuff isn't random. Junkyard's carefully selected examples of American engineering." When they reached the hidden hangar, Bradley grew serious. "Before we go in there, I want you boys to understand something. If what you've described is authentic, you're about to become the guardians of irreplaceable pieces of American history. That's a responsibility, not just an opportunity." Miguel nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood what Bradley meant. The moment the hangar doors opened and the lights flickered on, Bradley's demeanor changed completely. He moved toward the nearest aircraft with the reverence of a man entering a cathedral, his eyes taking in every detail of the preserved P-51 Mustang. "Dear God," he whispered, approaching the plane with his hands clasped behind his back, as if he didn't trust himself not to touch it. "She's perfect, absolutely perfect." He walked slowly around the aircraft, noting details that were invisible to Miguel's untrained eye. The condition of the aluminum skin, the authenticity of the paint scheme, the proper placement of every rivet and panel line. "This isn't just a restored warbird," Bradley said, his voice filled with awe. "This is a time capsule. Look at this data plate original factory installation. The engine logs show 0 time since overhaul, dated 1945. Your grandfather didn't just preserve these planes, he maintained them in flyable condition." When Bradley reached the P-82 twin Mustang, he had to sit down on a nearby workbench. His hands were shaking as he examined the aircraft identification plates. "Boys," he said quietly, "do you know what this is?" "A P-82 twin Mustang," Mateo said. "We looked it up online. Not just any P-82. This is tail number 44,65,168, Desert Fox. She was the last twin Mustang to see combat, flying reconnaissance missions over Korea in 1950. She was shot down, presumed destroyed." Bradley's voice grew thick with emotion. "I wrote a paper about this aircraft 30 years ago. She's been listed as missing, presumed destroyed in every historical record." Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. "But she's here." "She's here," Bradley confirmed, "which means your grandfather somehow acquired an aircraft that the military thinks was lost in combat." They moved to the experimental F-7F Tigercat, and Bradley's excitement reached fever pitch. He pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the data plates with the intensity of a forensic investigator. "This is impossible," he muttered, cross-referencing the serial numbers with a notebook he'd pulled from his jacket. "According to every record I have, this prototype was scrapped at the Grumman factory in 1946. "But it's here too," Mateo observed. Bradley looked up at them, his expression mixing wonder with something approaching fear. "Boys, what you have here isn't just a collection of rare aircraft. These are planes that, according to official records, don't exist. And that creates a very complicated situation." He spent the next hour documenting everything, photographing data plates, engine serial numbers, and modification details that proved the aircraft's authenticity. When he finally closed his notebook, his expression was grave. "Miguel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you told anyone else about these aircraft?" "Just you. And the librarian helped me research them, but I didn't tell her where they were." "Good. That's very good." Bradley wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "These planes represent a potential value of $15 to $20 million. But more than that, they're historically significant beyond measure. And that means there are people who would do almost anything to get their hands on them." "What kind of people?" Miguel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Unscrupulous collectors who don't care about provenance. Military aircraft dealers who work in grey areas. Government agencies who might want to reclaim what they consider stolen property." Bradley's expression was serious. "Your grandfather kept these hidden for 60 years, for good reasons." As they prepared to lock up the hangar, Bradley pulled Miguel aside. "I want to help you with this, but we need to be very careful about how we proceed. The first thing you need is proper documentation proving your legal ownership. The second thing you need is expert help authenticating and potentially restoring these aircraft." "Restoring them?" "Miguel, these planes were meant to fly. Keeping them locked in a hangar forever isn't preservation, it's just a different kind of death. But getting them airworthy again will require expertise you don't have, and money you probably don't have either." As they drove back to Phoenix, Miguel's mind raced with possibilities and problems. The aircraft were worth a fortune, but only if he could prove he owned them legally. They were historically significant, but that significance would attract attention he might not want. They were preserved pieces of aviation history, but preserving them properly would require resources he didn't possess. "Dad," Mateo said as they neared the city, "what are we going to do?" It was a good question. Miguel thought about the developers who wanted to buy the land, about his mounting debts, about Mateo's college dreams. He thought about his grandfather's letter and the responsibility of preserving something larger than himself. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we're going to figure it out." That evening, Miguel called Tom Bradley. "I want to move forward with authentication and restoration," he said, "whatever it takes." "Good man," Bradley replied, "but you're going to need help. I know someone who might be perfect for this project, a retired WASP pilot named Dorothy Martinez. She actually flew aircraft like these during the war. And if we're going to do this right, you'll need someone who understands the historical documentation process." "Like who?" "I'm thinking of a graduate student I know at Arizona State. Brilliant girl, writing her dissertation on World War II aviation archaeology. Her name is Nora Chen, and she's exactly the kind of person your grandfather would have trusted with his secret." Miguel made notes as Bradley gave him contact information. 3 aircraft, 3 experts, and 90 days until his grandfather's debts came due. It seemed impossible, but looking at Mateo's excited expression, Miguel realized impossible had suddenly become necessary. "Make the calls," Miguel said. "Let's see if we can bring these birds back to life." Dorothy Martinez arrived at the junkyard on a Tuesday morning that promised to be scorching by afternoon. Miguel watched through the chain-link fence as a restored 1965 Ford pickup truck navigated the dirt road, its turquoise paint gleaming in the early sunlight. The woman who climbed out of the driver's seat moved with the purposeful economy of someone who'd spent decades around dangerous machinery. She was small and wiry, probably in her mid-80s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore work boots, jeans with creases sharp enough to cut glass, and a leather jacket that had clearly seen decades of use. "You must be Miguel," she said, extending a hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Tom Bradley tells me you've got some birds that need attention." Yes, Mom. I appreciate you driving out here. Dorothy looked around the junkyard with obvious approval. Reminds me of the aircraft boneyard at Davis, Monthon. Your grandfather knew how to organize things properly. She paused, studying Miguel's face. You look like him, you know. Same stubborn jawline. You knew my grandfather? Esteban Salazar? Hell yes, I knew him. We had some dealings over the years. She'd call me when he needed specific parts or technical information. Never told me what he was working on, but I always suspected it was something special. Her eyes gleamed with curiosity. Tom says you found his project. Miguel led her through the maze of stacked cars toward the hidden hangar, with Mateo trailing behind carrying a cooler of water and sandwiches. The desert heat was already building, and Miguel could see heat waves shimmering off the metal surfaces around them. When the hangar doors opened and the lights revealed the three preserved aircraft, Dorothy Martinez did something Miguel hadn't expected. She laughed. Not with humor, but with pure joy, the sound echoing off the metal walls like music. You magnificent old bastard, she said to the empty air, presumably addressing Miguel's grandfather. You actually did it. She approached the P-51 Mustang first, her practiced eye immediately cataloging details that meant nothing to Miguel, but clearly spoke volumes to her. She ran her fingers along the wing's leading edge, testing the control surfaces, examining the propeller hub with the attention of a surgeon. This is a D model, probably built in early 45, she said without looking up. Still has her original Merlin engine, you can tell by the exhaust stack configuration. And look at this paint scheme. That's not a restoration job. That's original factory application. Miguel watched her work, impressed by the depth of her knowledge and the obvious affection in her voice when she spoke about the aircraft. Tom said you flew planes like this during the war. Flew them, ferried them, test. Flew them after maintenance. Crashed a couple. Dorothy grinned, the expression transforming her weathered features. I was with the WWII Women Air Force Service pilots. We flew everything the Air Force had, delivering new aircraft from factories to bases, towing targets for gunnery practice, testing repaired planes to make sure they were safe for the boys to fly. She moved to the P-82 twin Mustang, and her demeanor grew more serious. Now this is something special. I only flew one of these, and only once. They were experimental when I was active, too new, too complicated, too valuable to trust to us girls. The bitterness in her voice was decades old but still sharp. But you could fly it now, Mateo asked. Dorothy looked at the teenager with amusement. Son, a pilot never forgets how to fly. The question isn't whether I could, it's whether these old bones should. When she reached the experimental F-7F Tiger Cat, Dorothy fell silent. She walked around the aircraft twice before speaking, her expression growing increasingly amazed. Miguel, do you understand what this is? Tom said it was some kind of prototype. It's the holy grail of carrier aviation development. Dorothy pulled out reading glasses and examined the data plates. This is the F-7F-3N variant. They were trying to create the ultimate night fighter for carrier operations. Twin engines, radar intercept capability, cannon armament. Only 3 were ever built. She opened a folder she'd brought with her, revealing pages of handwritten notes and photocopied technical documents. I've been researching your grandfather's activities since Tom called me. Esteban wasn't just a collector, he was connected to people inside the military who shared his passion for preserving aviation history. Miguel felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to come together. What kind of people? Test pilots, mechanics, even some officers who believed these aircraft were too important to scrap. After the war, there was enormous pressure to destroy experimental aircraft to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands. Your grandfather seems to have been part of an informal network that rescued the most significant examples. Dorothy showed Miguel her research files, which contained correspondence between his grandfather and various military personnel dating from 1946 to 1980. The letters spoke in coded language about preservation projects and historical documentation, But the meaning was clear. Esteban Salazar had been systematically saving aircraft that would otherwise have been destroyed. "The question," Dorothy said, closing the folder, "is what we do with them now." "We want to restore them," Mateo said before Miguel could answer. "Make them flyable again." Dorothy smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "That's a noble goal, but it's not simple. Each of these aircraft will require hundreds of hours of work and thousands of dollars in parts and materials. And that's assuming we can find qualified people to do the work." "What would you need?" Miguel asked. Dorothy pulled out a notebook and began making lists. "For starters, complete engine overhauls. These Merlins haven't run in decades. Reseal, gasket, and fluid line will need to be replaced. The hydraulic systems will need rebuilding. All the rubber component tires, hoses, seals have degraded beyond use." She continued documenting requirements: avionics updates to meet modern flight safety standards, structural inspections to ensure airworthiness, propeller overhauls, fuel system rehabilitation. The list grew longer with each aircraft they examined. "Conservatively," Dorothy said, adding up rough estimates, "you're looking at $300,000 minimum to get all 3 aircraft airworthy, and that assumes we can find the parts and expertise we need." Miguel felt his hopes deflating. Even if the aircraft were worth millions, he didn't have hundreds of thousands to invest in restoration. "But," Dorothy continued, "there might be another way." She explained that the vintage aircraft community was small and passionate, with collectors and enthusiasts willing to invest in significant restoration projects in exchange for partnership arrangements. Museums and educational institutions sometimes provided funding for historically important aircraft in return for display rights or educational access. "And there are grants available for projects that preserve military aviation history," she added. "Your grandfather's documentation could make these aircraft eligible for funding from veterans organizations and historical societies." As they prepared to leave the hangar, Dorothy turned to Miguel with an expression that mixed challenge with encouragement. "This isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be cheap. But if you're serious about honoring your grandfather's legacy, I'll help you. These aircraft deserve to fly again." Miguel looked at the 3 preserved warbirds, thinking about his grandfather's decades of solitary dedication, about Mateo's excitement, about the responsibility of preserving something larger than himself. "When do we start?" he asked. Dorothy grinned. "How about tomorrow? And Miguel, we're going to need help. Tom mentioned a graduate student who might be perfect for this project. Someone who understands both the historical significance and the documentation requirements." "Nora Chen? That's the one. If she's half as good as Tom says, she'll be invaluable for proving the authenticity and historical importance of these aircraft." Dorothy gathered her papers and headed for the door. "Call her tonight. Tell her Dorothy Martinez vouches for the project's legitimacy. That should get her attention." As Miguel locked the hangar, he felt the weight of commitment settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just the inheritor of his grandfather's secret, was becoming the guardian of a legacy that stretched back to a war fought before he was born and forward to generations who would learn about courage through the roar of restored engines. Miguel stared at his grandfather's war journal until the words blurred together on the yellowed pages. He'd found it hidden behind a loose panel in the hangar's workbench, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved as carefully as the aircraft themselves. The leather-bound book contained entries dating from 1944 to 1946, written in his grandfather's careful script, documenting not just maintenance work, but emotional reflections on the war and the men who flew these machines. March 15, 1945, one entry read. "Lost Charlie Morrison today over Berlin. His P-51 Betty's Dream came back without him. Engine damage, bullet holes in the wings, but she brought herself home. How do you scrap a plane that tried so hard to save her pilot? How do you melt down courage?" Miguel felt a chill reading his grandfather's words. The P-51 in the hangar bore the name Betty's Dream on its fuselage, the same aircraft mentioned in this decades-old journal entry. Nora Chen had arrived that morning with enthusiasm that reminded Miguel of Mateo's excitement, but tempered with academic rigor that impressed even Dorothy. The graduate student was in her late 20s, with dark hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved expressively when she explained historical concepts. She'd driven out from Tempe in a Honda Civic, loaded with research materials, cameras, and laptop computers. "This is extraordinary," Nora said, photographing pages from the journal, primary source documentation of aircraft preservation efforts immediately following the war. This could fundamentally change how we understand post-conflict military surplus disposal. She'd spent the previous week researching the legal framework surrounding Miguel's inheritance, working with university lawyers to ensure that any restoration project would comply with federal regulations governing historic aircraft. Her preliminary findings were encouraging. Esteban Salazar had acquired the aircraft through legitimate military surplus channels, with documentation that established clear legal ownership. "Your grandfather was meticulous about paperwork," Nora explained, showing Miguel folders of correspondence and purchase receipts. "Every transaction is documented, every modification logged, every maintenance action recorded. This level of documentation is unprecedented for civilian-owned warbirds." Miguel continued reading the journal while Nora worked. Each entry revealed more about his grandfather's motivation for preserving the aircraft. The journal wasn't just a maintenance log, it was a memorial to fallen pilots, a testament to the bond between airmen and their machines. "June 8, 1945, another entry read. "The war in Europe is over, but they're still scrapping everything. Saw them cutting up a B-17 yesterday, Memphis Belle type, veteran of 30 missions over Germany. The crew chief was crying as they fed her into the smelter. Said she'd brought his boys home every time, and this was how America thanked her." Dorothy found Miguel sitting on the hangar floor, the journal open in his lap. "Heavy reading?" she asked, settling down beside him with the careful movements of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of hard use. "I never understood him," Miguel said quietly. "When I was growing up, he seemed so distant, so focused on this place, that I thought he cared more about junk than family. But reading this, he wasn't collecting scrap metal. He was saving lives, or at least the memory of lives." Dorothy nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding born of shared experience. Men of that generation didn't talk about the war the way we do now. They couldn't explain why seeing a P-51 scrapped felt like watching a comrade die again. So they just did what they thought was right and hoped someday someone would understand. Mateo emerged from underneath the experimental Tiger Cat, where he'd been helping Nora document the aircraft's unique modifications. His face was streaked with dust and oil, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "Dad, you need to see this," he said, holding up a small metal plate. Nora found it bolted inside the cockpit. It's like a dedication plaque. Miguel examined the brass plate, which bore an engraved inscription: "In memory of the men who flew these birds into harm's way, and in hope that future generations will remember their courage. E. Salazar, 1946. "He wasn't just preserving aircraft," Nora said, her voice filled with admiration. "He was creating a memorial. Each of these planes represents specific pilots who were killed in action. The documentation shows he researched the combat history of every aircraft he acquired, learning the names and stories of the men who flew them." As the day progressed, the team made remarkable discoveries. Hidden compartments in the hangar contained additional documentation, letters from pilots' families thanking Esteban for preserving their loved ones' aircraft, correspondence with other collectors working to save historically significant planes, and detailed plans for eventually creating a memorial museum. "This changes everything," Dorothy said, examining blueprints for a proposed aviation museum that Esteban had drawn up in the 1960s. "Your grandfather didn't see this as a private collection. He saw it as the foundation for something larger." Miguel felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier with each revelation. His grandfather had spent 40 years not just preserving aircraft, but documenting their stories, honoring their pilots, and planning for their eventual public display. The hidden hangar wasn't just storage, it was a shrine to sacrifice and heroism. "We can't just restore these planes," Miguel said, looking around at his unlikely team. "We have to honor what he was trying to do." Nora's research had revealed another crucial detail. The experimental Tiger Cat was the only surviving example of its type, making it not just valuable, but historically irreplaceable. Museums around the world would pay enormous sums for the opportunity to display such a rare aircraft. "But there's a problem," Nora said, showing Miguel correspondence she'd discovered. "Word is getting out about the discovery. I've received 3 calls this week from aircraft brokers asking about rare warbirds in Arizona. Someone is spreading information about what you've found." Dorothy's expression grew serious. "The vintage aircraft community is small. News travels fast, and not everyone in the business operates ethically. If the wrong people learn about these planes..." She was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the junkyard. Through the hangar's small windows, Miguel could see 2 black SUVs parking near the gate. "Expecting company?" Dorothy asked. Miguel shook his head, but he recognized one of the vehicles. That's the developer who wants to buy the land. They watched as James Morrison and 3 other men got out of the SUVs. Even from a distance, Miguel could see that these weren't development consultants. They moved with the purposeful confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. "They're not here about real estate," Dorothy observed grimly. "Not with that kind of backup." Miguel felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. Someone had told Morrison about the aircraft, and the developer's interest in the land had nothing to do with building a resort. He wanted the planes. "We need to get out of here," Nora said, already packing her research materials. "If they find us in here with the aircraft..." "No," Miguel said firmly. "This is my property, and these are my grandfather's planes. I'm not running." Dorothy studied the approaching men through the window. "Miguel, those aren't businessmen coming to negotiate. They're here to take what they want, and they probably don't care much about legal niceties." As the men approached the hangar, Miguel made a decision that surprised even him. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him into abandoning his grandfather's legacy. But he also wasn't stupid enough to face 4 hostile strangers without backup. "Mateo, call Tom Bradley," he said quietly. "Tell him we need help now." "Dorothy, is there another way out of here?" "There's a back door that leads to the workshop," she replied. "But Miguel, I'm not leaving these planes undefended," Miguel said, his grandfather's stubbornness asserting itself across generations. "But I'm also not letting my son get hurt because of my decisions." Outside, the men had reached the hangar doors. Miguel could hear Morrison's voice, no longer friendly and persuasive, but cold and demanding. "Mr. Salazar, we know you're in there. We need to talk." The pounding on the hangar doors echoed through the metal building like gunshots. Miguel's heart hammered as he realized Morrison and his men weren't going to wait for an invitation. Through the small window, he could see them examining the heavy padlocks that secured the entrance. "Back door now," Dorothy whispered urgently, but Miguel held up his hand. "Wait," he said, pulling out his phone. "I want to record this." "Miguel, this isn't the time for evidence gathering," Nora protested. But he was already activating his phone's video camera. The sound of metal on metal filled the air as Morrison's men began working on the locks with what sounded like bolt cutters. Miguel positioned himself where he could film through the window while staying out of sight. "Mr. Salazar," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there. We found the aircraft registration numbers in your grandfather's files. We need to discuss ownership issues." Miguel's blood ran cold. Aircraft registration numbers. His grandfather's files. How had Morrison gotten access to private documents? The first lock gave way with a sharp snap, followed quickly by the second. As Morrison's men worked on the third lock, Miguel caught sight of something that made his breath catch. One of the men was wearing a military-style tactical vest, and another carried what looked like legal documents. "This isn't a shakedown," Miguel whispered to the others. "They think they have legal claim to the planes." The hangar doors swung open, flooding the space with desert sunlight. Morrison entered first, followed by three men who definitely weren't real estate developers. The leader was tall and thin with silver hair and the bearing of a career military officer. Behind him came two younger men who moved with the efficient alertness of private security. "Mr. Salazar," Morrison said, spotting Miguel immediately. "I'm glad you decided to stay. We have a great deal to discuss." Miguel stepped forward, keeping his phone's camera recording despite his trembling hands. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The military-looking man laughed, a sound without humor. "Private property? Mr. Salazar, these aircraft were stolen from the United States government in 1946. Your grandfather was a thief, and you're in possession of stolen federal property." "That's a lie," Miguel said, but even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. His grandfather's journal had mentioned acquiring aircraft through unofficial channels. The man pulled out a folder thick with official-looking documents. "I'm Colonel William Foster, retired Air Force. I've spent 30 years tracking down aircraft that went missing from military surplus operations after World War II. Your grandfather's P-82 twin Mustang was reported as destroyed in transit to a scrapyard in 1946, but it never arrived for demolition." Foster approached the twin Mustang, running his hand along its wing with the familiarity of ownership. "Serial number 44,65,168. Desert Fox." She was supposed to be cut up for aluminum ingots, but Sergeant Esteban Salazar filed false transportation reports and diverted her here instead. "You can't prove that," Dorothy interjected, but Foster turned to her with a cold smile. "Actually, I can. We found Sergeant Salazar's service records and his correspondence with other military personnel involved in similar theft operations. Your grandfather was part of a conspiracy to steal experimental aircraft from the government." Nora stepped forward, her academic training overriding her fear. Even if that were true, the statute of limitations on theft charges would have expired decades ago. And Mr. Salazar has clear title to this property and everything on it. Foster's expression grew harder. "Miss, these aren't ordinary stolen goods. These are classified military aircraft containing technology that was considered state secrets. There is no statute of limitations on espionage-related theft." Miguel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd believed about his grandfather's noble preservation efforts was being reframed as criminal activity. But something about Foster's story didn't ring true. "If these planes are so classified and valuable," Miguel said, "why hasn't the government been looking for them for 60 years? Why show up now through a real estate developer instead of through official channels?" Foster and Morrison exchanged a glance that lasted just a moment too long. In that brief look, Miguel saw something that gave him hope, uncertainty, maybe even deception. "The government has been searching," Foster said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These aircraft represent millions of dollars in taxpayer investment. They belong in military museums, not hidden in private collections." Mateo, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "If you're really working for the government, where are your badges? Where's your warrant?" Foster's jaw tightened. "This is a preliminary investigation. We're here to assess the situation and determine the best course of action." "Which is why," Morrison added smoothly, "we're prepared to offer a reasonable settlement. Mr. Salazar can keep the land and receive fair compensation for his cooperation in returning the aircraft to their rightful owners." Miguel's phone was still recording, capturing every word of the exchange. Something about the way Morrison and Foster interacted suggested they weren't government agents at all, but private operators with their own agenda. "I want to see official documentation," Miguel said. "Government identification, legal warrants, proof that you have authority to make these claims." Foster reached into his jacket, and for a moment Miguel thought he was going for credentials. Instead, he pulled out a thick manila envelope and dropped it on the hangar floor. Those are copies of your grandfather's service records and the original theft reports, Foster said. Everything you need to understand that these aircraft belong to the United States government, and possession of them makes you an accessory to theft of federal property. Miguel picked up the envelope, his hands shaking as he examined the documents. They looked official military letterhead, official seals, typed reports detailing the theft and concealment of 3 experimental aircraft by Sergeant Esteban Salazar and accomplices. But as Miguel studied the papers, he noticed something odd. The dates were consistent, the signatures looked authentic, but the paper itself was too white, too crisp, for documents that were supposedly 70 years old. These weren't copies of original documents, they were forgeries, and recent ones. "These are fake," Miguel said quietly. "Excuse me?" Foster's voice carried a dangerous edge. "These documents are forgeries. The paper, the printing, they're not from 1946. Miguel looked up at Foster with growing confidence. "You're not government agents. You're con artists." Morrison stepped forward, his friendly demeanor completely gone. "Mr. Salazar, I think you're making a serious mistake. These men have official authority." "No, they don't," Dorothy interrupted. She'd been examining the aircraft while the others argued, and now she held up a small metal plate she'd removed from the experimental Tiger Cat. "This aircraft has a civilian registration number that was issued to Esteban Salazar in 1947, legal registration, legal ownership, properly documented with the Civil Aeronautics Administration." She showed Miguel the plate, which bore a number that clearly identified the aircraft as civilian property. "Your grandfather didn't steal these planes. He bought them legally from military surplus, just like thousands of other aircraft after the war." Foster's face had gone pale. "That registration is fraudulent." "Actually," Nora said, pulling out her laptop, "I can verify the registration right now through the FAA database." Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she accessed federal aircraft records. After a moment, she looked up with a smile. "All 3 aircraft are registered to Esteban Salazar, with clear chain of title dating back to 1946 and 1947. Legal purchases from military surplus operations." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of desert wind whistling through the hangar's gaps. Foster and Morrison looked at each other with expressions that confirmed Miguel's suspicions. They weren't government agents. They were thieves who'd been caught in their own deception. "I think," Miguel said, still holding his recording phone, "you gentlemen need to leave my property now." Foster's military bearing cracked, revealing something uglier underneath. "This isn't over, Salazar. Those aircraft are worth $15 million. People will kill for less than that." "Is that a threat?" Miguel asked, making sure his phone's microphone picked up every word. Morrison grabbed Foster's arm. "We should go. We can discuss this through proper legal channels." As the 4 men headed for the hangar doors, Foster turned back one last time. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Salazar. Those planes have attracted attention from people much more dangerous than us." After they left, Miguel, Dorothy, Nora, and Mateo stood in stunned silence. Finally, Dorothy spoke. "Well," she said dryly, "that was educational." Miguel was still staring at the forged documents, trying to process what had just happened. They knew about the planes, they knew the serial numbers, the registration information, everything. "Which means," Nora said grimly, "someone is providing them with inside information. Someone who's seen your grandfather's records." Miguel thought about the attorney who'd handled the estate, the librarian who'd helped with research, the various experts they'd consulted. Any of them could have leaked information to the wrong people. "We need to move fast," Dorothy said. "If con artists like Foster know about these planes, it won't be long before more serious criminals find out. And next time, they might not bother with fake documentation." Miguel looked at the 3 preserved aircraft, understanding for the first time that his grandfather's secret was no longer secret. The hidden hangar had been discovered, the aircraft's existence was known to dangerous people, and his family was now a target. But his grandfather's ownership documents were real, the aircraft were legally his, and Miguel was determined not to let anyone steal his family's legacy through intimidation or fraud. "We're going to restore these planes," he said firmly, "and we're going to do it fast, before anyone else tries to take them away from us." The workshop hummed with activity as dawn broke over the desert. Miguel had converted his grandfather's main building into mission control for the restoration project, with Dorothy coordinating engine work, Nora managing historical documentation, and Mateo applying his woodworking skills to fabricating replacement wing panels. They had exactly 37 days until the foreclosure deadline, and every hour counted. Tom Bradley had arrived before sunrise, with a trailer full of specialized tools and 2 additional mechanics he trusted completely. The vintage aircraft community had rallied around the project once word spread about the authentication and legal threats. Donations of labor, parts, and expertise flowed in from collectors and enthusiasts across the Southwest. "The P-51's Merlin engine is in better shape than we hoped," Dorothy reported, her hands black with oil as she emerged from underneath the cowling. "Your grandfather must have preserved it with Cosmoline. Everything internal is perfect. We can have her running within the week." Miguel felt a surge of pride and gratitude toward the grandfather he'd never truly known. Every day of restoration work revealed new evidence of Esteban Salazar's mechanical expertise and dedication to preservation. The aircraft weren't just stored, they'd been maintained in a state of suspended animation, ready to return to life after decades of patient waiting. The experimental Tiger Cat presented bigger challenges. Its twin-engine configuration required specialized knowledge that even Dorothy and Tom had to research extensively. Nora had contacted the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, whose curators provided technical drawings and maintenance manuals that hadn't seen daylight since 1946. This aircraft represents a crucial development in carrier aviation. Nora explained to a documentary crew that had arrived to film the restoration. "If we can get it airworthy, it will be the only flying example of this experimental type in the world." The documentary team was part of Nora's strategy to protect the aircraft through public exposure. The more people who knew about the legitimate restoration project, the harder it would be for criminals like Foster to make future claims against the planes. Mateo had thrown himself into the project with teenage intensity, working 12-hour days, learning skills his great-grandfather would have admired. His precision with woodworking tools translated perfectly to aircraft restoration, and he'd become Dorothy's most trusted assistant for detail work. "Look at this," he said, showing Miguel a wing panel he'd restored. The aluminum skin gleamed like jewelry, every rivet perfectly aligned, every surface smooth and true. "Great. Grandfather's note said this panel was damaged by flak over Germany. I rebuilt it exactly the way he described in his journal." Miguel watched his son work with tools that had belonged to 3 generations of Salazar men, seeing connections that stretched across decades of family history. Whatever happened with the restoration, Mateo had found something valuable in the processor connection to his heritage and pride in skilled craftsmanship. But not everything was going smoothly. On day 23, Miguel arrived at the junkyard to find that someone had tried to break into the hangar during the night. The locks hadn't been breached, but tool marks around the door frames showed that professionals had attempted entry. "They're getting bolder," Tom Bradley observed, examining the scratches in the metal. "And more sophisticated. These aren't the same amateurs who tried to con you with fake documents." Miguel had installed security cameras after Foster's visit, but whoever had attempted the break-in had avoided the camera angles with precision that suggested surveillance and planning. The message was clear: someone was watching the restoration project and waiting for an opportunity. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Dorothy said during their daily planning meeting. "If we can get at least one aircraft flying and documented publicly, it becomes much harder for anyone to claim ownership or steal them quietly." The team focused their efforts on the P-51 Mustang, Betty's dream, which was closest to airworthy condition. Working in shifts around the clock, they rebuilt the engine, restored the hydraulic systems, and updated the avionics to meet modern safety requirements while preserving the aircraft's historical authenticity. Miguel's auto repair shop had become secondary to the restoration project. He'd turned away routine customers and delegated basic repairs to Mateo, who balanced high school with increasing responsibilities in both businesses. The financial pressure was enormous parts, and materials for the restoration were expensive, and Miguel's regular income had virtually disappeared. We could sell one of the aircraft to fund restoration of the other two, Nora suggested during a particularly difficult week when money ran short. Even a non-flying P-51 would bring enough money to complete the project. No, Miguel said firmly. My grandfather kept them together for 60 years. We're not breaking up the collection. His stubborn determination reminded Dorothy so strongly of Esteban Salazar that she sometimes had to remind herself she was working with the grandson, not the grandfather she'd known decades earlier. On day 30, disaster struck. A parts shipment containing critical engine components for the twin Mustang disappeared in transit. The tracking information showed the package had been delivered to the junkyard, but it never arrived. Without those parts, the P-82 restoration would be delayed by weeks or months. This wasn't random theft, Tom Bradley said grimly. Someone intercepted that shipment specifically to sabotage our timeline. Miguel felt the walls closing in. 37 days had become 7, and they were no closer to getting the most valuable aircraft airworthy. The foreclosure deadline loomed, and his creditors were no longer accepting promises about future aircraft sales. That evening, as Miguel sat in his grandfather's workshop surrounded by flight manuals and restoration guides, he found himself reading the old man's journal again. Near the back, in entries from 1946, he discovered something that changed everything. July 4, 1946, his grandfather had written. Charlie Morrison would have been 23 today. Instead of celebrating independence, I'm thinking about the independence his sacrifice purchased for all of us. Betty's dream sits in the hangar, waiting for someone who understands that freedom isn't free and some debts can never be repaid. If anyone reads this someday, remember that these birds aren't just machines, they're monuments to courage. They deserve to fly again, not for money or glory, but for memory. Miguel closed the journal, understanding finally why his grandfather had spent a lifetime preserving these aircraft. They weren't investments or collector's items, they were sacred trust. A responsibility to honor sacrifice and preserve courage for future generations. He found Dorothy in the hangar, working by lamplight on the P-51's propeller governor. Despite her age, she'd been putting in 16-hour days, driven by the same sense of mission that had motivated his grandfather. We're going to fly them, Miguel said quietly. All 3 aircraft, at the same time. A formation flight that shows the world what my grandfather preserved. Dorothy looked up from her work, grease-stained and exhausted, but still sharp. Miguel, we don't have time to get all 3 airworthy. The P-51 is almost ready, but the others. Then we make time. We work around the clock. We call in every favor. We do whatever it takes. Miguel's voice carried the determination of a man who'd found his purpose. My grandfather spent 60 years waiting for someone to understand what he was preserving. I'm not going to let him down. Dorothy studied Miguel's face in the lamplight, seeing something that hadn't been there before, a resolution that went deeper than money or family pride. It's not about the foreclosure anymore, is it? No, Miguel said. It's about finishing what he started. It's about making sure Charlie Morrison and all the others aren't forgotten. Over the next week, the team worked with intensity that bordered on obsession. Word of their mission spread through the vintage aircraft community, bringing volunteers from across the country. Retired Air Force mechanics, aviation historians, and warbird enthusiasts descended on the junkyard like a military operation. The breakthrough came when Mateo discovered a cache of original parts hidden in a sealed container behind the workshop. His great-grandfather had stockpiled spare components for decades, anticipating exactly the kind of restoration they were attempting. "Look at this," Mateo said, showing Miguel precision, machined engine parts still in their original packaging. He saved everything we need to finish the twin Mustang. With 3 days remaining until the foreclosure deadline, all 3 aircraft were mechanically sound and ready for flight testing. The P-51 had already completed ground runs, its Merlin engine producing a sound that brought tears to Dorothy's eyes. The twin Mustang was scheduled for engine start the next morning, and the experimental Tiger Cat waited its turn for resurrection. But Miguel knew that mechanical readiness was only part of the challenge. The real test would come when 3 aircraft that had been silent for 60 years took to the sky together, carrying with them the dreams and sacrifices of a generation that had saved the world and then quietly returned to ordinary lives. As the sun set on day 34, Miguel stood in the hangar, surrounded by the fruits of collective dedication and love. Tomorrow would bring the first test flights, and then, if everything went according to planar formation flight, that would honor his grandfather's vision and Charlie Morrison's sacrifice. The aircraft gleamed under the work lights, no longer museum pieces but living machines, ready to reclaim their place in the sky. Miguel felt his grandfather's presence in the hangar, not as a ghost, but as a continuation, a legacy that connected past courage to present determination and future memory. 3 days to save not just the Junkyard, but the dreams of men who had flown these same aircraft into history. Dawn broke over the desert with a kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail sharp and present. Miguel stood on the improvised runway they'd cleared through the Junkyard, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Behind him, 3 restored aircraft sat ready for their first flights in over 60 years, their polished aluminum skin reflecting the morning light like mirrors. The media had arrived before sunrise, reporters from aviation magazines, local television crews, and documentary filmmakers who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Word of the restoration project had spread through social media and aviation forums, drawing spectators from across the Southwest. Cars lined the dirt road leading to the Junkyard, their occupants setting up cameras and folding chairs in the desert scrub. Dorothy emerged from the P-51's cockpit wearing a flight suit that looked like it might have seen service during the actual war. At 83, she moved with the careful precision of age, but her eyes held the bright alertness of a pilot ready to fly. "Betty's dream is ready," she announced, pulling off her flight helmet to reveal hair that had been carefully pinned up in a style reminiscent of the 1940s. "Fuel is topped off. Engine temperatures are perfect, and all systems are go." Miguel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Seeing Dorothy in the cockpit of his grandfather's P-51 created a connection that spanned generations, a living link between the young woman who had ferried fighters during the war and the preserved aircraft that had waited decades for this moment. Tom Bradley completed his final inspection of the twin Mustang, running his hands along the propeller blades with the reverence of a man touching history. "Both engines are running smooth as silk," he reported. "Your grandfather maintained these birds like they were going to fly tomorrow." The experimental Tiger Cat presented the greatest challenge. No pilot alive had experience with its unique characteristics, forcing them to rely on original test pilot reports and engineering specifications. A retired Navy test pilot named Jack Morisono, relation to the Charlie Morrison mentioned in the grandfather's journal, had volunteered to make the first flight based on his experience with similar experimental aircraft. "She's an unknown quantity," Morrison admitted, adjusting his parachute harness. "But the engineering is sound. And if she was safe enough for test pilots in 1946, she's safe enough for this old fool in 2024. Nora moved between the aircraft with cameras and recording equipment, documenting every detail of the historic moment. Her dissertation had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive study of post-war aircraft preservation that would redefine how historians understood civilian contributions to aviation heritage. "This is unprecedented," she said, photographing Dorothy's pre-flight inspection. 3 experimental or rare aircraft, preserved in flyable condition for 60 years by a single individual. Your grandfather created the most significant private aviation museum in American history. Mateo stood beside his father, wearing one of his great-grandfather's original flight helmets that Dorothy had found in the workshop. The leather was cracked with age, but the boy wore it with pride that made Miguel's chest swell with emotion. "Are you ready for this?" Miguel asked his son. "I've been ready my whole life," Mateo replied, though he'd only learned about the aircraft 6 weeks earlier. "I just didn't know it until now." The first engine start sent a sound across the desert that hadn't been heard in decades. The P-51's Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then settled into the distinctive roar that had once filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Spectators applauded spontaneously, understanding they were hearing something extraordinary. Dorothy advanced the throttles carefully, feeling the aircraft's response after 60 years of silence. The propeller bit into the thin desert air, and Betty's dream began to move forward under her own power for the first time since 1946. "Control, this is Betty's dream requesting permission to taxi," Dorothy radioed, using call signs they'd established with the local flight control tower. "Betty's dream, you are cleared to taxi. Good luck making history." The P-51 moved down the improvised runway with mechanical precision, every system functioning exactly as designed. Miguel watched through binoculars, noting how naturally Dorothy handled the aircraft despite decades away from military fighters. The twin Mustang started next, its twin engines producing a harmony of sound that resonated across the junkyard like mechanical music. Tom Bradley's years of restoration work showed in every smooth operation, hydraulics responding instantly, control surfaces moving with perfect precision, engines running with the reliability of Swiss watches. "Desert Fox is ready for taxi," Tom reported, his voice tight with emotion. Finally, the experimental Tiger Cat roared to life. Its distinctive engine note was different from the others, deeper, more aggressive, with an undertone that spoke of experimental power and untested capabilities. Jack Morrison's decades of test pilot experience showed in his careful, methodical approach to the unfamiliar aircraft. "Experimental 7 is systems go," Morrison reported. "All parameters normal, ready for taxi and takeoff." Miguel stood at the edge of the runway, watching 3 pieces of aviation history prepare for resurrection. Around him, hundreds of spectators held their breath, understanding they were about to witness something that connected them directly to the courage and sacrifice of World War II aviators. The morning air was perfect for flying, calm, cool and clear, with visibility that stretched to the mountains 50 miles away. If his grandfather's spirit was watching, Miguel thought, he couldn't have asked for better conditions for the flight he'd dreamed about for 60 years. "This is it," Dorothy's voice crackled over the radio. "Formation flight of a lifetime, 60 years in the making. Let's take these birds home." The P-51 lifted off the desert runway like a bird remembering how to fly. Dorothy's touch on the controls was sure and gentle, feeling the aircraft respond to her commands with the precision its builders had designed into every rivet and wire. As the Mustang climbed into the morning sky, 60 years of silence ended with the roar of a Merlin engine singing its ancient song of power and freedom. "Betty's dream is airborne." Dorothy's voice carried pure joy across the radio frequency. "All systems nominal, climbing to pattern altitude." Miguel watched through his grandfather's binoculars as the P-51 banked gracefully above the junkyard, its polished aluminum skin catching the sunlight like a silver arrow. The sight brought tears to his eyes, not just for the mechanical achievement, but for the vindication of his grandfather's faith that someday these aircraft would return to their natural element. The twin Mustang followed 2 minutes later, Tom Bradley's steady hand guiding the unique fighter off the runway with the confidence of a pilot who understood the aircraft's quirks and capabilities. The twin fuselage design looked strange against the desert sky, but its flight characteristics were smooth and predictable. "Desert Fox is airborne and climbing," Tom reported. "She flies like a dream. Your grandfather knew what he was preserving." Finally, Jack Morrison lined up the experimental Tiger Cat for takeoff. The prototype fighter had never been intended for mass production, and no pilot alive had experience with its specific handling characteristics. Morrison's approach was methodical, using decades of test pilot training to assess the aircraft's behavior as he advanced the throttles. The Tiger Cat accelerated down the runway with surprising authority, its twin engines producing enough power to lift the heavy fighter off the ground with authority. As it climbed away from the desert floor, Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd just tamed an unknown beast. Experimental 7 is airborne. She's got some personality, but she's honest. Requesting permission to join formation. Miguel's heart hammered as he watched 3 pieces of aviation history converge in the sky above his grandfather's junkyard. The formation they achieved wasn't the precise military spacing of wartime operations, but something more appropriate for their civilian resurrection, a loose, graceful arrangement that showcased each aircraft's individual character while honoring their shared heritage. Nora stood beside Miguel, filming the historic moment while tears streamed down her face. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. "Look what he made possible." The 3 aircraft flew a wide circle around the junkyard and surrounding desert, their engines harmonizing in a chord that hadn't been heard since the 1940s. Spectators on the ground applauded and cheered, but Miguel barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the sky, where his family's legacy soared on aluminum wings that his grandfather had lovingly preserved for this exact moment. "Formation Salazar, this is Phoenix approach." The air traffic controller's voice carried professional respect. "You have priority handling for your historic flight. Recommend heading 270 for best photographic opportunities over Camelback Mountain." The 3 aircraft turned west toward Phoenix, flying low enough for ground observers to appreciate their details, but high enough to clear the desert mountains safely. Dorothy led the formation with the confidence of a pilot who'd flown these same routes 8 decades earlier, when she'd ferried military aircraft from factories to bases across the southwest. As they approached Camelback Mountain, the formation tightened slightly, creating the kind of photographic opportunity that would grace aviation magazines for decades. The experimental Tiger Cat flew slightly high and to the right, its unique configuration clearly visible. The twin Mustang held position on the left, its twin fuselages creating an unmistakable silhouette. And leading them all, Betty's Dream flew with the grace of an aircraft that had been born to rule the sky. Miguel watched through binoculars as the formation passed over suburban Phoenix, knowing that thousands of people below were looking up at aircraft most of them had never seen outside of museums. The sight connected the present to a time when such formations had been common, when young men had flown similar aircraft into combat and changed the course of history. "This is what he wanted," Miguel said aloud, thinking of his grandfather's journal entries and decades of patient preservation. Not just to save the aircraft, but to let them fulfill their purpose. The formation flight continued for 45 minutes, covering the valley from Scottsdale to Glendale before turning back toward the junkyard. Each pilot reported perfect mechanical performance, engines running smoothly, all systems functioning normally, fuel consumption within expected parameters. As they approached for landing, Dorothy's voice carried deep satisfaction. "Formation Salazar requesting permission to land. Mission accomplished." "Formation Salazar, you are cleared to land. Welcome home." The 3 aircraft landed in the same order they'd taken off, each pilot greasing their touchdown on the improvised desert runway with the skill of professionals honoring irreplaceable machines. As the engines wound down to silence, the crowd of spectators erupted in sustained applause that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Miguel ran toward the aircraft as the pilots shut down their engines, his heart full of gratitude and pride. Mateo was right beside him, wearing his great-grandfather's flight helmet and grinning with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing dreams made real. Dorothy climbed out of the P-51's cockpit with the careful movements of age, but her face glowed with the satisfaction of a pilot who'd just completed the flight of a lifetime. She pulled off her helmet, revealing hair that had come loose from its careful pinning, and looked at Miguel with eyes that sparkled with achievement. "Your grandfather's birds have remembered how to fly," she said simply, "and they are magnificent." 6 months later, Miguel stood in the same spot where he'd first watched his grandfather's aircraft take flight, but the junkyard had been transformed. What had once been chaotic rows of rusted vehicles was now the Salazar Aviation Heritage Museum, with carefully maintained exhibits showcasing the evolution of American aviation technology from the 1940s through the present day. The 3 restored warbirds occupied positions of honor in a new climate-controlled hangar that preserved them while allowing public access. Visitors could walk around the aircraft, read about their histories, and listen to audio recordings of Dorothy Martinez describing what it felt like to ferry such fighters during World War II. "We had 4,700 visitors last month," Nora reported, consulting the tablet computer that managed the museum's operations. Her dissertation had become the foundation for the museum's historical interpretation, and she'd accepted a permanent position as chief curator after completing her doctorate. Miguel nodded, but his attention was focused on a group of elementary school children who were listening with rapt attention as Mateo explained the mechanical principles that made the P-51's Merlin engine so effective. His son had become one of the museum's most popular volunteer guides, combining technical knowledge with the enthusiasm of someone who'd helped restore the aircraft with his own hands. The successful formation flight had attracted national attention, bringing aviation enthusiasts, military historians, and potential investors from across the country. Museum professionals had offered partnership arrangements that provided funding for ongoing preservation while ensuring public access to the aircraft. The Smithsonian had partnered with them to create traveling exhibits that would share the restoration story with audiences nationwide. But perhaps most importantly, the restored aircraft had generated enough revenue through museum admissions, educational programs, and aviation events to secure the property permanently. The foreclosure threat that had once seemed insurmountable was now just an unpleasant memory, replaced by financial stability that honored both Esteban Salazar's legacy and the family's future. Dorothy emerged from the experimental Tiger Cat's cockpit, where she'd been conducting one of her popular living history presentations for a group of military veterans. At 84, she showed no signs of slowing down, maintaining all 3 aircraft in airworthy condition and flying demonstration flights for special events. The Korean War veterans want to schedule another formation flight for their reunion in September, she told Miguel. They're particularly interested in the twin Mustang, since it saw service in Korea. Miguel smiled, remembering how overwhelming such requests had seemed when they'd first started getting them. Now, the museum hosted regular events that brought together veterans, aviation enthusiasts, and families wanting to understand the history that these aircraft represented. James Morrison and his associates had quietly disappeared after the formation flight brought media attention to the restoration project. Legal experts had examined their forged documents and concluded they'd been part of an elaborate fraud designed to intimidate Miguel into selling the aircraft far below their actual value. The publicity surrounding the museum's success had made any further attempts at deception impossible. The success had also brought unexpected connections to Miguel's family history. Veterans organizations had helped identify Charlie Morrison, the pilot whose P-51 had become Betty's dream. His family had attended the museum's grand opening, bringing with them photos and personal items that now formed part of the permanent exhibit honoring his sacrifice. "Your grandfather saved more than just aircraft," Charlie Morrison's nephew had told Miguel during the dedication ceremony. "He saved the memory of men who gave everything for their country. Charlie would be proud to know his plane is still inspiring young people to understand the cost of freedom." Miguel walked through the museum's exhibits, noting details that connected past sacrifice to present opportunity. A section dedicated to the women Air Force Service pilots featured Dorothy's personal memorabilia, alongside technical displays about the aircraft she'd flown. Another exhibit explored the post-war aircraft surplus program that had made his grandfather's preservation efforts possible. But the heart of the museum remained the 3 flying aircraft and the story of their resurrection. Visitors could read Esteban Salazar's journal entries, examine the tools he'd used for preservation, and understand the decades of patience that had made the restoration possible. Mateo had thrived in the museum environment, discovering aptitudes for both mechanical work and public speaking that surprised even Miguel. The teenager who'd once complained about inheriting a pile of junk now spoke passionately about preserving aviation heritage for future generations. "I've been thinking about college programs in aviation technology," Mateo told his father as they locked up the museum for the evening. "Maybe aerospace engineering, with a focus on historic preservation." Miguel felt a familiar pride watching his son plan a future that honored both education and family tradition. The boy wore one of his great-grandfather's original work shirts, modified to fit his teenage frame, and carried himself with confidence that came from meaningful work and purpose. Nora joined them for the evening walkthrough, checking security systems and ensuring the aircraft were properly secured for the night. Her relationship with Miguel had developed slowly and naturally, built on shared commitment to the museum's mission and mutual respect for the legacy they were preserving. "The commemorative Air Force wants to include our aircraft in the national tour, celebrating the 80th anniversary of Day," she told them. "It would mean flying the formation to air shows across the country, sharing the story with audiences who might never visit Arizona." Miguel considered the proposal, thinking about his grandfather's vision of preserving these aircraft for education and inspiration. The tour would expose thousands of people to the story of civilian aviation preservation, possibly inspiring others to save historic aircraft in their own communities. As they prepared to leave, Miguel took one last look at the 3 aircraft that had transformed his family's life. In the soft light of the hangar's security lamps, they seemed ready to fly again at a moment's notice, living machines, rather than static museum pieces. His grandfather's letter was displayed in a place of honor near the entrance, its words having taken on deeper meaning through the restoration process. "Some things are worth more than money they're worth preserving, for the generations who will never know the sound of freedom flying overhead." Miguel had learned that the sound of freedom wasn't just about aircraft engines or military history. It was about having the courage to honor the past while building something meaningful for the future. It was about understanding that the greatest treasures aren't always made of gold or silver, but of memory, purpose, and the unbreakable bonds between generations. Walking out into the desert evening, Miguel could hear the distant sound of a commercial airliner passing overhead, its lights blinking against the stars. Somewhere up there, passengers were traveling to destinations his grandfather could never have imagined, carried aloft by technology that traced its lineage back to the aircraft preserved in the hangar behind him. The circle was complete, but the story would continue as long as there were people willing to remember that freedom, like the aircraft that defended it, required careful preservation and constant dedication to keep it flying.